Today's webinar, as you all know, is Help with Medicaid. And we're going to hear from two people who have been working in the field for quite some time, and I believe are going to be very helpful to you for information on this. We are AgeWise Colorado. As you know, we're here to help you find the resources you need when you need them. We vet all our service providers, so you know they're trustworthy. We do ask you to mute your screen as an attendee and turn off your screen and mute your audio. It helps because we're recording this, and it helps with the recording and then the future posting on our website for others to see. As we are providing an essential service, we are a nonprofit, and we can't help but ask for donations, no matter how small or large. They help us. Most of us are all volunteers, and funding goes to enhance the website and do the marketing and things like that we need. Like any business, we have expenses. We also have room for plenty more volunteers. So if you go to the website, you can find those volunteer opportunities. Today's speakers are Richard Vincent. Richard is an attorney here in Denver, specializing in elder law, and Jennifer Hanson, who is going to help explain to you how to get to Medicaid. And again, visit us anytime. You can also call us. We're here to help. That's all we want to do, is help you find what you need. With that, I'll stop sharing. And Richard, let's start off with you and learn about how we can protect our assets and qualify for Medicaid, excuse me. I do that
and
all the time.
Well, and that's probably the first point I'd refer to, because it's very common that people confuse Medicare with Medicaid. And, Medicare is a public health program where you pay into the system, you're entitled to it. Doesn't matter how much money you have, you're still entitled to those services. Whereas Medicaid, is a means tested program and tied to financial eligibility. And like I said, oftentimes everybody kind of mixes those two up. And it's important because Medicare does not cover long-term care beyond a maximum of 100 days. They'll cover 20 days of skilled care. And then from day 20 to 100, they'll cover the amount above, I think, about $210 a day. But after 100 days, you're completely on your own. And the reason it's so important is that long-term care is expensive. It's ridiculous. Average, I think, cost for in-home care is anywhere from $30 to $60 an hour. Assisted living is pretty broad term and covers, a lot of different areas, but we see probably an average of $5,500 to $8,000 a month. And then the ridiculous figure is associated with skilled nursing care, which in the Denver area currently averages close to $12,000 a month. I had heard there's a facility in Boulder now that's charging $17,000 a month. And it's just kind of a reflection of how our medical system is kind of broken. So it's expensive. So how do people pay for, that kind of care? One, out of savings. And obviously, if you're in the skilled care facility, it can go pretty quick. There is long-term care insurance, but most folks don't have that. And then, which is the reason why ultimately Medicaid comes into play. And I was kind of looking at some figures. It's currently covering, I think, about 60 to 70% of long-term care. So pretty significant portion. And, the likelihood of needing long-term care, I was looking at some figures earlier today, but saying 65 to 70% chance of needing some form of long-term care. And that's not, in a nursing home for 5 years kind of thing, but still pretty significant portion that will experience that, kind of need for long-term care. Um, so when I'm talking about Medicaid here again, I'm not talking about other types of Medicaid that, kind of the health first type thing. I'm talking about more of, the long-term care type situations for elderly, blind, disabled, those kind of things. Um, so how do people qualify for this program? Well, first, I guess I should say Medicaid is a jointly funded federal state program where the federal government kind of matches state dollars. And it's about, I think about 50-50 right now. And the federal government sets down the basic eligibility rules. States have some variations on those. And here in Colorado, we kind of have two kinds of Medicaid for long-term care, one for nursing homes. And then we have these Medicaid waiver programs under home and community-based services. And that's where they will pay for assisted living if the facility's Medicaid certified. And best we can tell, about 50% are. About 95% of the nursing homes are Medicaid certified. And then this HCBS program, there are also some in-home benefits where somebody can come into the home and provide assistance. There's some adult daycare benefits with transportation, some minor home modification things, but more sporadic. The in-home type of services are more kind of respite for caregivers so they can get out. So kind of those two kinds, but the eligibility requirements are pretty similar for, all of those three, and they're threefold. And the first is, what we hope never happens, and that's medical necessity. And what happens is we apply at the county level, they arrange an assessment, and it's not a full-blown physical type doctor visit or anything else. It's more of an interview. And they're looking to see, does the person need significant assistance with at least two activities of daily living? So dressing, bathing, feeding, transfer, continence. Then there's also a cognitive screen where they pick up the dementias, need for medication management, those types of things. So that obviously is only met as it occurs. But again, that's the first of the three. The second is income. And on the income side for long-term care, they only look at the applicant's income. They don't look at if they're married, they don't look at the spouse's income. That spouse, that which we call a community spouse, that person's income can be anything. And that's something important to kind of keep in mind for some of the planning options, that we look at. But, and income's rarely, if ever, a problem for the applicant, because as long as the applicant's gross monthly income is less than what it costs on average for a month in a nursing home in the region, they're going to be income eligible. And you hear all kinds of misinformation that, you get too much income to qualify, but pretty rare when somebody's monthly gross income is more than $11,500 a month, which is the average cost of care in the region for Denver. If their income is more than 2901, there's some other monkey business you have to go through involving what they call an income trust or a Miller trust. But essentially, it's just a pass-through bank account where you put all of their gross income and then you immediately write a check to the facility. So it's money in, money out. But the thing to keep in mind is that, no, your income can be up to, in the Denver area, $11,555 a month and still qualify. There are income protections for married couples. For that well spouse, again called the community spouse, they look to see if they have a minimum income of at least roughly $2,500 a month. And if they don't, if they're below that, then they're entitled to a portion of their spouses, the institutionalized spouse's income, to bring them up to that 2555. So, if their income's 2,000, they get $555. If it's 1,000, they get $1,555. And that figure can be increased up to about $3,900 a month if the person has higher than usual shelter expenses. So if they have a mortgage or if they're paying rent, um, they figure they'll calculate that figure. They'll add in utilities, property taxes, trash removal, some other basic shelter expenses. And if those exceed, a lot of numbers here, $766 a month, every dollar above that's $1 they add to their entitlement above that 2555, up to, like I said, that 3,900. So spouse does not have to impoverish themselves. And there are situations where they don't say move that person to assisted living or skilled care because they think they're not going to have any money to live in. And as many people know, the caregiver's health is always in jeopardy when they're providing that kind of care at home. So sometimes not knowing that fact that, yeah, they're still entitled to keep all their income, maybe get more of it from their spouse. And as I'll talk about in a minute, they get to keep a certain amount of assets. So those are spousal protections, they call them. The third requirement is assets. And unlike income, on the asset side, they count the assets of the couple, regardless of whose name they're in. And they count them all except for they don't count the principal residence, one automobile, personal property, prepaid burial funeral plans, medical equipment, and then the one I always kind of wonder about, wedding and engagement rings, which tells me at some point somebody was trying to count them. But they don't count those. And then for a married couple, they will see what they are counting, and they'll carve out the first roughly $60,000 of countable assets. And kind of like there's income protections, there's an asset protection, and they'll allocate those 160,000 in assets to that well spouse. If you're a single individual, then you're limited to $2,000 in countable assets. So kind of different standards there. So what do people do when, if you're married and you get more than 160,000 in countable assets, or you're single and have more than 2,000, you have to, quote, spend down. And the way that's typically accomplished, there's kind of two kind of umbrellas, one of which is more applicable to single individuals, the other to married couples. But essentially your goal, or our goal when we're doing Medicaid planning, is to accelerate Medicaid eligibility and preserve as many assets as possible. And so if we've got a married couple who has more than 160,000, let's say, they've got 360,000, they've got $200,000 too much. What do? Well, they could just spend it until they get down to that figure. But there are a lot of other strategies that are obviously much better. And those strategies kind of boil down to two planning umbrellas, one called conversion options, and the other sometimes for married couples involves gifting, but gifting is typically more involved with single individuals. Before I get into that, the two other things you need to know are estate recovery. That's where you hear, I'm going to lose my home or something along that line. When the federal government gives the states the money, they require each state to have a program where they try to recover those Medicaid expenditures. And they can get it from the probate asset, and they can only get it after the person dies. Get it from their probate assets, which there usually isn't a probate because they can't ultimately have more than 2,000 in their name, or their real estate interests. And that's where you get concerned about the home. So one of the first things we do is we transfer title to the well spouse, so there's nothing to recover. under that estate recovery program. In Colorado, they also can't recover against jointly held property, because jointly held property, when one person dies, the other person automatically owns it. If that's the well spouse, then again, there's nothing to lien, and something called a life estate, but I won't get into that. So you got this married couple, they got 200,000 too much. What can they do? They can convert some of that excess 200,000 into exempt assets. For instance, they can make home improvements. They can pay off debt. They can buy a newer, more expensive car. They can buy any personal property, which is, things, furniture, whatever. So personal property, they can prepay burial, funeral, cremation plans for, both of them. That's something somebody's going to have to pay at some point. So you might as well use some of those countable assets, convert them into exempt assets. One of the biggest conversion options for married couples, and again, this kind of starts getting complicated, but it involves something called a Medicaid compliant annuity. And an annuity is where you pay an insurance company money and they pay it back to you over a period of time with some kind of return. And the Medicaid regulations provide that if the annuity is non-cancelable, non-assignable, issued by, an insurance company, and repayable to the annuitant, usually in this case, the well spouse, within their life expectancy, they won't count it. And so you can end up converting, in this example, 200,000 into an income stream payable to the well spouse. And remember, I said the well spouse's income can be anything, and they get to pick the term as well. So that 200,000, if you said pay it back to me over 5 years in monthly installments of 3,300 a month, that's a way to get down to that 160,000 very quickly and still have that money end up coming back to you. And the reason that can work is that you're not limited to that 160,000 for the rest of your life. Once your spouse is determined eligible, they stop looking at your assets, so that income coming back to you can then be put in the bank or reinvested or whatever. So that's one that's very attractive to well spouses. I mean, when we've got married couples, we change the will of the well spouse, so in case they die first, it doesn't all go to the other spouse and disqualify them, and some other types of planning measures. The other planning kind of program involves gifting, and the way gifting works in Medicaid is that when you apply, you're required to disclose gifts that you've made within the prior 5 years. And they're not talking birthday presents or those kind of things, but essentially bigger gifts. And what they do is when you disclose that, then they'll calculate a period of ineligibility that'll delay your Medicaid benefits. And they divide the value of the gifts made during that 5 years, prior 5 years, by what it costs on average for a month in a nursing home in the state. Throw in the rural areas, and that figure is currently 10,475. And that's the number of months that they will say you are ineligible. And that penalty will not start until you have been determined otherwise eligible, which means you apply and they see you meet the medical, you meet the income, you got less than 2,000 in countable assets and would be eligible but for the gift, and that gets that penalty started. So if it's a 15-month penalty, if you waited 15 months and applied, you'd have another 15 months that you'd have to pay. So that's something that's sometimes often overlooked. If one option on the gifting side is waiting out that 5-year look back period. And sometimes, the gift was made 2 or 3 years ago. Sometimes it makes sense to private pay for the remaining 2 years of that. Typically not if it's skilled care, but on the lower level. Other times people, if there are significant gifts that they're looking at, they reserve enough to private pay for 5 years, or with the clock ticking on that 5-year look back period, and wait to apply for 61 months. So you could give away $3 million and apply 61 months later, and there'd be no penalty. If you made the mistake of applying at 59 months, then you'd have a penalty period that went on for years. So in that example, but that's one kind of strategy people where there's a lot of money that's involved sometimes look at. The other involves for a single person that Medicaid compliant annuity I talked about, but that one is directed to pay to the applicant and pay for their care. And the basic concept is if I give away roughly half, it makes me ineligible for X number of months, let's say 15 months. I use the part I didn't give away to private pay during that 15 months. So it's structured to cover the cost of your care during the 15 months of your penalty period, and to get the penalty period started, because they don't count it, gets you below the 2,000. And so after 15 months, penalties expired, annuities paid out, and Medicaid can kick in. So for single individuals, that's one. And also then they have the conversion options like prepaid burial, those kind of things, situations. So those are kind of, and there's, a lot of different options. I guess the thing to keep in mind is that there are always options, and it just depends on the family's particular circumstances, the amount of funds that they have to spend down, if any, those kind of situations. There are exceptions under gifting where you can gift to a caregiver child who's lived with you 2 years, provided care such that it's kept you out of assisted living or a skilled care facility. And you can transfer the house to them, or you can transfer assets to a disabled adult child of any age and not have a penalty associated with that. So there are some other exemptions that are kind of built in. Let's see what else I got. Again, this is kind of pretty broad brush, but again, there would be options, and there's so much misinformation out there. A lot of it coming from the county. I even had somebody who sold their home and spent it all down, and then applied because they were told they had to sell their home by somebody at the county. So good to, speak with an elder law attorney, because, one misstep can make you cost you a lot of money. And then there's the issue of getting it through. You can be eligible, go through all these things, but then you got to do that application. And I'll tell you, the most frustrating part I find is sometimes dealing with the counties in terms of these applications and things they continue to ask for, and losing applications and saying, oh, we need this, and then you provide it, and then later, oh no, you need this too. So that's where somebody like Jennifer and Helping Hands really can come into play and really be helpful. And so now I'll turn it over to Jennifer, and you kind of talk about how you take away that frustration and get it through.
Thanks, Richard.
Sure.
Barbara, I'm going to try to share my screen here. So yeah, I'm Jennifer Hanson. I'm the owner of Helping Hands Consulting. And what we do, and the only thing we do, is specialize in long-term care Medicaid and helping clients and families navigate this complicated process. So I was just kind of hoping, my objective today is to kind of talk to you about that process. What that looks like. That way, if you are, chatting with families, you can either give them a little bit of guidance, or, be able to direct them to someone who can give them more guidance. So first and foremost, let's just overall talk about the process. So first and foremost, you have to submit an application. An application is just the technical request for Medicaid. How does Medicaid know that John needs Medicaid unless he submits an application? Okay. So you submit your application. Ultimately, an eligibility site, the county eligibility site, and Medicaid technician, a case manager, whatever you want to call them, is going to review the application and any documents needed. Okay. If they don't have everything they need, they are going to send out a request to the individual. All right. Giving them a little more time to submit some extra items. Okay. Assuming all those items are provided, part of that next step is going to be, Richard mentioned you've got to have a medical necessity for long-term care Medicaid. So long-term care Medicaid is the only program where Medicaid is actually going to come lay their eyes on the person. Okay. They're actually going to come have a meeting. They're going to walk in that nursing facility and look at John, and they want to make sure that he needs a long-term care service. Okay. So after, you've submitted your technical request for Medicaid, they've reviewed the documentation, they've received their results from the functional assessment. Ultimately, there is a decision on the case. Okay. And I'd like to kind of reiterate something Richard said, is that you have to go through this process. So like sometimes individuals, have been eligible for Medicaid for years. Okay. They just never had a medical need to actually go after it. So obviously they need to submit an application and do that. Sometimes people are in the process of spending down their assets. You know what I mean? They would actually go through this same process, even if they are meeting with an elder law attorney or trying to do some sort of protection strategy themselves, whatever have you. 9 times out of 10, this process I'm about to say doesn't change, because Richard mentioned you still have to sometimes apply and get through the obstacles of Medicaid. So this is applicable for all of those situations. So how do we apply? Okay. And I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here and get everybody cross-eyed. I'm hoping I'm going to send this presentation out to Barbara in hopes that y'all can just use it more for a reference tool. But essentially, in terms of applying for long-term care Medicaid, there's two buckets someone's going to fall in. One of the buckets is going to be that this person has no active Medicaid in place. Okay. Or maybe they had it a few years ago, it terminated. Maybe they've never applied for Medicaid, but there is no active coverage of Medicaid of any type in the Medicaid system. If that is the case, they will have to submit an application for healthcare coverage, or Medicaid also allows them to submit an application for public assistance. Where do you find those applications? You would go to the state Medicaid office. The state Medicaid office is the Colorado Department of Healthcare Policy and Financing. Here is their website. When you get to their website, on the main page, there is a big button that says Apply Now. Okay. Click that button, and it's going to give you 2 options. So, and the state Medicaid office may kill me for saying this, but the 2 options are that you can apply for electronically through a program called Colorado Peak. The state Medicaid office really pushes this option. Okay. What you find is this option works great for other Medicaid programs. I personally find, and I think you will, if you speak to other professionals who help a lot with long-term care Medicaid, they will back me in saying that usually for long-term care Medicaid applications, this electronic program does not work great. Okay. It is an option though. So I'm talking about it here. The other option is as you apply by mail, which obviously you can also bring it in by person. But really the goal here is that you're actually getting a paper application, okay, and completing it. But let's go back to what I originally said. So we get these paper applications, and you can either submit the medical assistance only application or the public assistance application, okay? So let's just kind of talk about that a little more. So obviously, if someone only needs long-term care Medicaid, I find that the medical assistance only application is actually easier to complete, okay? Why? Because it only asks the questions that are applicable to Medicaid. Now, if this person is also applying for, financial assistance, maybe food stamps, then they would definitely want to submit the public assistance application, because only if they submit that application will Medicaid actually be able to consider them for those other programs. All right. But really, even if you're only applying for Medicaid, you can do the public assistance only application too. So Medicaid only accepts both. But if you're tacking on a financial program of any sort, like I said, whether it be food stamps or some sort of cash assistance, you definitely have to do that public assistance application. Like I said, I personally like the medical assistance only application because the way it just asks the questions really align with the Medicaid regulations. So let's say, so the other option, so that is for someone who has, like I said, no active coverage. They're starting from scratch, okay? But let's say someone comes to you and they are already on like a Medicare savings program, or they're on, you know, Magi Medicaid or like SSI Medicaid, like some sort of Medicaid that is not long-term care. As Richard already mentioned, there's multiple Medicaid programs, okay? And so this person already has an active case in the Medicaid system of some sort, but now we're trying to tack on long-term care Medicaid, all right? For those individuals, there is actually an abbreviated form that they can actually complete. That form, again, same website. You go to the state Medicare website. There is not a very easy way to find this form, to be totally transparent. I have found the only way to find it. And I mean, obviously we have it saved in our file at this point, but the only way to find it on the website is to actually search for it in the toolbar. And this is what it looks like, you know, it will come up. And essentially it's just like, hey, check here that I'm receiving Medicaid, check here saying I want to add long-term care Medicaid. And then in order for them to identify who's trying to do that, it asks for some demographic information at the bottom and a signature. So they do make it easier, a little bit easier for those individuals to tack on the long-term care Medicaid. Now, you know, I always say the most difficult part of actually getting long-term care Medicaid is proving your case. Okay. Whenever you submit your packet to Medicaid, to be totally transparent, you're guilty until you're proven innocent. Someone is ineligible until they prove that they're eligible. So we have a lot of clients that call us, or I don't even say clients, just individuals that call us that say, my mom, you know, she only makes $800 a month. She has one checking account that has, you know, no money in it. She lives paycheck to paycheck. We applied for Medicaid. We got denied. Okay. You know, someone that appears to be, you know, a very straightforward case. 9 times out of 10, maybe even 10 out of 10, the issue was with the verifications. Okay. Again, they did not prove their case based on Medicaid standards. So not only when someone submits an application, they have to submit all the documentation along with it. Okay. If when Medicaid reviews that case, so let's go back to our initial thing, apply, review. So when Medicaid reviews the case, they're going to look through all that documentation. If some things in that file do not suffice for Medicaid standards, or Medicaid has more questions, needs more documents to prove that this person's eligible, they're going to send out a request to Medicaid requesting those documents. Okay. They will give that individual 10 business days to turn in the documents from the day they mail out the letter. All right. So like, for example, people that use our services, we always say, we're going to just delay. We want to submit a 100% complete packet right out the gate. Okay. We're going to delay submitting the packet a week or two, even a month if necessary, to get everything Medicaid needs. You know, so we can submit everything all at once. Nothing's piecemealed, nothing's lost. And the goal is when the Medicaid technician processes it or touches it for the first time, they can process it and approve it right there. If not, it's going to halt the case because they're going to have to send out a request for more information. Okay. Now, sometimes the stuff we submit with a packet, sometimes it's like 30 documents, and sometimes it's like 500 documents. Okay. The case file can go from either like this or literally like this. It all depends on the case. But and so where I'm going with this is this list of verifications is pretty generic, but it's a good start. Okay. So let's just talk about the documents that someone usually needs to get together. All right. So how do we prove our identity and citizenship? I will preface by telling you that Medicaid does have some pretty good interfaces in place with some federal and state entities to prove identity and citizenship where the individual has to provide nothing. Okay. However, sometimes those interfaces do not work. They especially do not work for individuals who were not born in the U.S. So let's say this individual is a citizen. They were a naturalized citizen. They've been over here as a citizen, sometimes for, 40, 50 years. However, Medicaid's interface, I can tell you, is not going to easily be able to prove behind the scenes that they're a citizen. Okay. So in the event someone does have to actually, those interfaces don't work and they have to prove their citizenship or identity, a birth certificate, social security card, photo ID, passport, and the ID and passport can be expired. It does not have to be current. So if they can even find an old one, that suffices. income. Income is tricky because as Richard mentioned in his presentation, what Medicaid is looking at is gross income. Okay. Gross income before taxes, before deductions. So essentially, you know, everybody just gets their income direct deposited in their bank account, right? So a lot of people say, well, look, that's what I'm getting is what I get every month, the direct deposits. That only proves what the individual nets. It does not prove what they gross. So for income, everybody needs to call and get a current year award letter from each of their income sources. So now many times Medicaid can look up Social Security income themselves through an interface. Sometimes that interface doesn't work. It only works. Let me just, it's gotten comical, you know, in our office because the interface only doesn't work if you don't have the verification. Okay. If you present Medicaid the verification, they didn't need it. You know, they were able to look at the interface. It's only if you're going to have trouble getting it, does the interface not work. But that is sometimes people can get through without providing something from Social Security. But usually with pensions, they're going to have to actually make a special call to their pension and request a current year award letter. It really, other than government entities, most private entities do not naturally send out what Medicaid's looking for. So what the person would need to ask for is a current year award letter documenting their gross income. Obviously, if the person's working, pay stubs, and then, you know, annuities, they would need like, you know, a letter from the annuity company. So assets, you know, generally speaking, Medicaid wants financial, you know, a full accounting of financial statements for the last 3 months minimum. Okay. Now they have the right to ask for 5 years worth of statements. Now Medicaid typically does not like to go after 5 years worth of statements or look through 5 years worth of statements any more than your client or the individual wants to go get 5 years of statements. However, in some situations, they do find that there's something questionable about the case and they need to look back those full 5 years. Okay. But at very minimum, they will need to provide 3 full months of accounting statements. So that's going to be bank, you know, checking statements, saving statements, if they have investment accounts, you know, and it has to be all pages. So that's why I keep saying full. When I say full, I mean all pages. So even if the account statement says 1 of 10, but only 5 even show applicable information, and let's say the other 5 are just trying to sell us a product or teach us how to balance our checkbook, you still have to provide all 10 pages. That I would say is one of the number one reasons why people get denied for Medicaid, because they're missing a page of a bank statement. Okay. Sometimes I feel like it's like common sense. Everything's pretty clear, but they took out the page that was intentionally left blank and they took out the page that where you balance your checkbook. That invalidated the whole statement. Okay. So if the individual has life insurance policies, they're going to need a current life insurance policy statement. Okay. Documenting all the values, the current face value, the current cash surrender value. If they have a burial policy, they're going to need to provide Medicaid that prepaid burial contract. If they have properties, they'll have to provide like a printout of the assessor statement documenting the current value. And then obviously if they have a trust, they'll need to provide the trust documents. With medical, they're going to need to provide Medicaid all the current health insurance they have, including Medicare, any other health insurance. And that's mostly because this other health insurance doesn't just go away because someone gets on Medicaid. That's a common question we get. You know, now, do they need all the health insurance they currently have once they go on Medicaid? Does it make sense usually for people to take 2 steps back and relook at things, you know, after they get on Medicaid to see if they need to keep paying for these things? Absolutely. But when you apply, Medicaid wants to know all the current health insurance you have at that time. And the reason being is because it doesn't go away. And Medicaid, by federal law, is the payer of last resort. So they always take the back seat. They're the secondary payer to all these other health insurances. So Medicaid says, since we take the back seat, we need to know what other health care you have, you know, what other health insurance you have on file. So we can make sure if you have that ambulance ride to the hospital, that ambulance bills your Medicare first or your United Healthcare coverage first before they bill us. So we're going to not pay until we see the other payers pay. Okay. In certain situations, you may need to provide some medical records to Medicaid, or there is a form in certain situations that the individual is responsible for completing called the professional medical form. And again, I don't want to get you too cross-eyed in these details, but sometimes that comes up. And obviously there's some legal paperwork Medicaid wants to see, like if there's a POA, guardianship, conservatorships, trust documents, Medicaid's going to want to see all those. So I mentioned this before. So with the verifications, they must meet Medicaid's verification standard. Okay. So again, complete. Nothing can be blacked out. All right. So a lot of times people may have a joint account with their sister. So their sister wants to like black out her stuff. Anything blacked out will just invalidate the whole statement. Okay. And everything has got to be usually very current. So current, at least current year dated. So like, for example, sometimes people may give you the life insurance policy that they got from 1985. That's in their safety deposit box. Well, Medicaid wants something current. I mean, that just says what some values were in 1986 and maybe some estimated values over the next 10 years. Most of the time, you're going to have to make a special call and get something very current to provide to Medicaid. And same thing even applies to these documents. If they send out a policy statement that says pages 1 of 2, Medicaid wants to see all pages of these things. So how to apply. So you have to go to a county or eligibility site to submit the application, or or mail it in, or some counties have like email systems you can use. Obviously, you can use that peak system that I'm not recommending. But to start the process, you submit the application, and ultimately the county or eligibility site will review that application and all these documents you provided. Okay. The case, and I'm just talking about some lingo here, just in case you hear it in the world. So it's called the case management agency. It used to be referred to as the single entry point. But about a year ago, Medicaid reworked some stuff with their single entry points, and they now call them all case management agencies. The case management agency will actually be the agency that manages the functional assessment. So they're the ones that are going to go lay the eyes on the individual, say that they actually need a long-term care service. So in the process of all this, the caseworker, somebody may need some more information from the individual. Rarely do they ever pick up the phone and call. Almost never. Okay. How they actually do it is they will always send a letter in the mail to the mailing address on file with them. So hopefully that's what you put on the application, is a good mailing address for this person. So they will just send that request and they will list what's, missing or what questions they have. And then there's a due date on there and you will turn it in by the due date. The regulation provides that applications must be processed by the county or eligibility site within 45 days. If a disability determination is in the process or needs to be made as part of this, they actually have 90 days. I'm just going to be honest with you. I have not seen a county, a government office actually process anything in 45 or 90 days in years. But the regulation does provide that. Okay. So a few more things I wanted to talk about here, because I really do find like you have facilities, they don't want to accept, a lot of Medicaid or Medicaid pending. It can be a hard discharge out of a hospital. Why? And I actually find is this slide here that most people that know just enough about Medicaid to be dangerous doesn't understand, and why facilities lose a lot of money and why there just ends up being such a negative stigma in the world around Medicaid. Okay. So as I've already told you, you submit this application, you submit all these beautiful documents to prove your case. Ultimately, when you submit this packet to Medicaid, you either fit in their box and they're going to approve you, or you don't fit in their box and they're going to deny you. Okay. The only happy middle ground is I need more information. I'm going to send out a request. If you turn it in, then I'll be able to tell if you fit in the box or not. If you don't turn it in, then you don't fit in the box because I couldn't figure it out. I had to deny you. Assuming the individual gets approved, Medicaid is ultimately going to come up with what they call an effective date of coverage. How do they get that date? They say, John, thanks for applying. We reviewed everything. It all looks good. And when we reviewed everything, there was a calendar day that you met all criteria for our program. And that is what we're going to call the eligibility begin date or the effective date. And what does that mean? That is the calendar day we're willing to start paying for care, for long-term care. Okay. So put in perspective here. So you submit an application on 1/1. So you meet the functional requirements on 1/10. The income you met as of 1/1. You don't meet the resource requirements until 1/20. So you submitted your application on 1/1. Remember I said they're going to take a few months to process this case. So you finally get a determination out there like in late February, March, if you're lucky. All right, John, you're approved. They would say the effective date of coverage in this example is 1/20. Okay. The biggest misconception about Medicaid is people always say, hurry up and throw that application in. Medicaid always goes back to the application date. Or I heard Medicaid can go back 90 days. Okay. My rebuttal to both of those things is Medicaid can go back to the application date. From the day you submit an application, Medicaid will look back 90 days to see what they're trying to figure out is there a day 90 days backwards or even forward that you met all criteria? What is the day that you fit in our box? That is the day Medicaid is going to start paying for care. So let me just drive the point home. Not the day they admitted into the facility, not the day the facility needed them to start covering, okay? The day John actually fit in the box and met all criteria, okay? So this is why you find nursing facilities don't like to take Medicaid pending, or facilities in general, because they take these cases, they assume Medicaid is going to go back to the date of admission, but John's check that he sent off to, a bill, a doctor, or an ambulance ride, maybe the check he paid the facility did not clear, and he did not get under $2,000 until January 20th. So essentially from January 1st to January 20th, John, let's just say an example here, John had $5,500 in his bank account. The check to spend down at or below $2,000 did not clear until January 20th. In Medicaid's eyes, that is the day he fit in the box. So there's going to be likely, in this example, a gap in coverage between January 1st and January 20th if the facility needed Medicaid to go back and pay, back to the application. Who is going to pay for that? If John can't, because now John's under $2,000. So who pays for that bill? Not Medicaid. I don't know. I don't know who pays for it, but it's not Medicaid. And Medicaid doesn't care. Usually it's the nursing facility that writes it off, right? And that's why this here is why nursing facilities find it very risky to take a Medicaid case. So a few other things here. I know I got to wrap up. So what does Medicaid pending mean? So I've kind of talked about it here, right? So from a provider perspective, Medicaid pending means provider, we want you to take John. Okay. John's at UC Health. John, we don't think has any money. He can't afford to pay private pay. Please take John and don't make John or his family come up with some private pay amount. He doesn't have another way to pay. We're waiting for Medicaid to, process the case. And please take him. And really what Medicaid pending means is John doesn't have a payer source. Please take John that doesn't have a current payer source in hopes that when Medicaid is processed and approved, Medicaid will pay backwards to the date of admission if that's what the facility needed. So go back to my previous example. When is the facility in this example going to start getting paid? January 20th. So if John goes in that facility on January 1st, they're not really, they're not going to get paid by Medicaid. So really they didn't take him Medicaid pending. Because Medicaid pending means we're not going to bill you, John, and we're not going to bill family. We have no other insurance to pay because we expect Medicaid to come back and pay for this calendar day. Come January 2nd, we expect Medicaid to pay for this calendar day. You know what I mean? But ultimately, when they get their billing forms for Medicaid, it says January 20th. So there's a gap in coverage here. So really the facility, if they looked at his financial records and, did some due diligence, they would have identified he had $5,500. They were not taking him Medicaid pending. Medicaid pending means John meets all criteria, and we expect Medicaid to come back and pay for this day, this calendar day. So if a facility or you're talking to someone and they don't meet all the criteria that day, then they're not Medicaid pending. Medicaid pending is Medicaid's not going to come back and pay until they meet all criteria. Sorry, let me get organized here. Yeah, so that's all I have. I know that was kind of a lot. What questions do you guys have? Do y'all have any questions? So the other comment I'll say, so like I said before, we specialize in long-term care Medicaid. The only thing we do in this office is helping clients navigate that process, ensuring they get all those documents. We're not in the business of throwing in an application and letting the county tell us or an eligibility site tell us what they need. We're going to review those cases in advance, make sure the application is completed appropriately, make sure all the documents are provided, with the initial packet, they suffice for Medicaid standards. we will deliver the documents, make all follow-up phone calls, until we get the approval we're looking for. So, and then we will stay on the case until the nursing facility gets all their appropriate billing forms or the services are set up in the home. So, so if you have anyone, I'd say our average, so we don't do asset protection. So if you have someone, I mean, our typical client falls with about 3 to 8 months of money left, I'd say. If you have someone who's in an assisted living, maybe doing their spin down, finishing out their 2-year spin down requirement, or admitting it to a nursing facility, but isn't going to make it, doesn't have quite a bit of money, that's kind of our niche. And we can help them dot those I's, cross those T's, and help them navigate that process. And we do recommend, even if they don't use us, that they do recommend use another professional. However, part of, our average time of getting a case through is about 30 to 40 days. If someone goes through the process alone, it does take, usually anywhere from about 3 to 6 months. So we are really able to expedite the cases just because we know how to get it through quickly.
And I would suggest if anyone's interested, you can find both Richard and Jennifer on our website through their companies, but also maybe you'd be willing to put your contact information in case someone wants to contact you soon. The other thing is there were a couple of questions in the chat box. Maybe Richard, you can share some of your answers so that the whole group can hear them in case they didn't look at the chat, unless anyone else has a question. No, I don't see any hands raised.
I had one for Jennifer. The thing I run into is the functional assessment gets delayed, and that's the last piece that comes into play. Have you got any suggestions how to move that along? Because maybe it's again, it seems like I'll get the application in, they'll be otherwise eligible, everything else, but there'll be some delay in the county doing the functional assessment.
Yeah, I mean, with nursing facility functional assessments, it'll come from the nursing facility. They'll always go back to the day the nursing facility faxed it in, even if it takes them a few weeks. I assume you're referring to more of those HCBS assessments.
Yeah.
In terms, a few things. One, if you're not doing a protection strategy and they're just naturally spinning down, because what's tricky about them is they won't do an assessment unless an application's on file. So sometimes we will that is some situation in which we may not do like a complete packet yet. I'll just do an application just so I can get the functional assessment started. And if they're just naturally spending down with no protection strategy, I sometimes have them like prepay the facility, like especially assisted living, like 2 or 3 months in advance, like further than usual to get down, just so we can like keep the process going and have plenty of time to do the HCBS. But if you're doing it like a half a loaf, like protection strategy, where that annuity date may not align with the functional assessment, what I do in those cases is submit the application only and still have everything else. But I would sometimes wait to execute that annuity. Like I'd give it some time to see if you can align, better align with the functional assessment before, you have all the statements up to that point, but just right when it's set up, then you can go purchase the annuity. But usually we'll delay, we delay doing that. We don't do the annuities in house, but like other legal counsel we work with, like we'll just recommend they delay it because I can't tell when it's going to line up yet. Now, a lot of those case management agencies have gotten a little better than where they were, a year ago, maybe 8 months ago. So hopefully you start seeing that, those issues decrease a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
I think the last comment I'll make is we can help with InnovAge cases as well, or like PACE cases. So with PACE, you still have to get on long-term care Medicaid. PACE, the InnovAges, any other PACE, program, a PACE provider can actually generally help with like easy applications, but many times they'll still refer to us for some of their complicated applications. So if y'all are sitting with someone and it just sounds like the case is a little, ugly, sometimes, just sending them straight to us and we can pull InnovAge in. We still have the same end result. It actually just gets done faster because InnovAge is going to do a lot of due diligence, kind of drag it out, then realize it's kind of over their head, then send it to us. where we could already be, a month into that process, and then pull N of H in when it's time. So we can help with N of H cases as well.
Well, I want to thank you both. That was just so very informative, and I really appreciate your taking the time because I'm sure you're both very busy people. There's
And
a
if y'all
lot
have any
going
questions
on.
that you want to just run a situation by me, don't ever hesitate to call. We're happy to help any way that we can.
Great. Well, then I would say thank you. Thank you to all the people that attended, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
We will be editing this to get rid of any dead time. We don't edit the content, and it should be up on our website sometime next week. And Jennifer, if you send that to me, I will certainly have it sent to the attendees.
Thanks, Barbara.
PowerPoint. Richard, thank you. Jennifer, thank you. Again, everyone have a great day.